On New Year's Eve last year, at exactly 11:48 p.m., I watched my husband slip a tiny silver vial into his tuxedo pocket, while everyone else counted down the final 12 minutes of the year. There were 214 guests in my father's penthouse ballroom that night, and not a single one of them knew that two people standing under the gold chandeliers were quietly planning to make sure my father never woke up again. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you handed them the keys to your entire life, then you'll understand why I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I didn't even move. I just listened. And before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do one thing for me like this video. Subscribe if you believe in quiet justice, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if the two people you loved most were secretly plotting against your own father? Because that night, I learned something terrifying. Betrayal doesn't sound loud. It sounds like a whisper behind a half-closed door. My name is Lila Bennett Whitmore. I was 32 years old that winter, and I worked as a veterinary surgical technician in Sacramento, California. Not glamorous, not powerful, but I was good at what I did. Steady hands, calm under pressure. The kind of person people trusted with fragile lives, including my father. Arthur Bennett was worth just over $500 million at the time, according to Forbes' regional estimates. He built Bennett Agricultural Technologies from a failing irrigation startup into one of the largest smart farming systems providers on the West Coast. He was also in a coma. 3 weeks before that New Year's Eve party, my father had collapsed in his office from what doctors called a massive ischemic stroke. He never regained consciousness. And since then, my stepmother, Margaret Harlow Bennett, had taken full temporary control of the company under his medical power of attorney. Margaret was not the kind of woman people questioned. She was elegant, in a cold, surgical way, perfect posture, precise words, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She married my father when I was 22, just after my mother died. She was only 11 years older than me. At the time, I told myself she made him happy. Now, I know better. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, was the other person I trusted without hesitation. We'd been married for 4 years. He worked as a corporate financial consultant, sharp, charming, and endlessly persuasive. He was the one who helped my father restructure international tax exposure 5 years earlier. My father used to call him the son I never had, which is why, at that party, when I saw Daniel step away from the champagne crowd and head toward the private hallway near my father's study, I didn't think anything of it. Not until Margaret followed him, and not until I saw the way she touched his arm. Not casually, not politely, intimately. It was a brief touch, 2 seconds at most. But it felt wrong enough that I set down my drink and walked toward the hallway without really knowing why. I stopped just before the study door. It was slightly open. Their voices came through clearly. Daniel spoke first. The neurologist confirmed he still has minimal brainstem reflexes, he said quietly. That's the problem. As long as he's technically alive, the board won't approve a permanent transfer of executive control. My heart stopped. Margaret's voice came next. Calm and precise. That's why we need to be patient, she said. Another cardiac event would change everything. Once he's declared brain dead, the trust triggers automatically. There was a pause. Then Daniel said something that split my entire world in half. And once that happens, we finally don't have to hide anymore. Margaret exhaled softly. You've been impatient lately, she murmured. It's only been 11 months. 11 months. My stomach dropped. 11 months. That was nearly a year. Nearly the entire last year of my marriage. Daniel chuckled quietly. You try sleeping next to her every night while pretending you're not in love with someone else, he said. It's exhausting. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't even breathe. Because in that moment, something inside me went completely still. And when people think revenge begins with anger, they're wrong. It begins with silence. Margaret spoke again. Just remember, she said, no mistakes. The insurance policy alone is worth $70 million. The company control is everything else. Once Arthur is gone, the estate passes through the trust exactly as planned, Daniel asked. And Lila? There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She's emotionally dependent, she replied coolly. She'll accept whatever explanation we give her. That was the moment I realized something worse than betrayal. They didn't just plan to destroy my father. They thought I was weak enough to let them. I stepped away from the door before they could see me. I walked back into the ballroom. The countdown started. 10, 9, 8. People laughed. Glasses clinked. Confetti cannons were loaded. I stood there, smiling, while my entire life quietly collapsed behind my ribs. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Everyone kissed someone. Daniel came back to me moments later, wrapping his arm around my shoulders like nothing had happened. His hand felt warm, familiar, completely foreign. He leaned down and whispered, "New year, new beginnings." I smiled back, because right then, I understood something he didn't. Yes, it would be a new beginning, just not the one he expected. And that was before I discovered the silver vial in his pocket. Because when I saw what was inside it later that night, I realized my father's coma might not have been an accident at all. At 1:17 a.m., less than 90 minutes after the fireworks faded over the Sacramento skyline, I found the silver vial in the inside pocket of Daniel Whitmore's tuxedo while he was in the shower. It was no bigger than my pinky finger, half filled with a clear liquid, and labeled with a pharmacy code that ended in 3 numbers I will never forget. 742. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew one thing immediately. It did not belong in my husband's pocket on New Year's Eve. If you've ever discovered something that instantly told you your life wasn't what you thought it was, tell me in the comments, did you confront the truth right away? Or did you do what I did and pretend you hadn't seen it? Because I chose silence, not out of fear, out of calculation. I slipped the vial back exactly where I found it. By the time Daniel stepped out of the bathroom, steam curling around his shoulders, I was sitting on the edge of the bed scrolling my phone like nothing had happened. "Long night," he said casually, drying his hair. "Yeah," I replied. "Worth it, though," he smiled. That same practiced, charming smile that had once convinced me he was the safest place in the world. Now it just looked like a mask. He climbed into bed and fell asleep within minutes, breathing slow and steady. I didn't sleep at all. Because as a veterinary surgical technician, I handle medications every day. Anesthetics, sedatives, cardiac agents. I know what they look like. I know what they smell like. And when I had uncapped that vial earlier, a faint, bitter odor had hit me immediately. Not alcohol. Not saline. Something synthetic, clinical, dangerous. By 3:42 a.m., I was sitting in the kitchen with my laptop open, searching pharmaceutical databases using the code I'd memorized. It took me 18 minutes to find a match. Potassium chloride injection, a concentrated solution used medically to treat severe potassium deficiency. But in the wrong dosage, administered improperly, it could stop the heart. Cleanly, quietly, without leaving obvious toxicology markers if timed correctly in a patient already critically ill. My hands went cold. Because my father wasn't just in a coma, he was on cardiac monitoring. And a sudden potassium spike in his condition would be explained as a natural complication. That was the moment the truth shifted from suspicion into something far darker. They weren't waiting for him to die. They were planning to make it happen. But the most chilling realization came next. This wasn't impulsive. This was medical knowledge, timing, access, planning, which meant this had been in motion long before New Year's Eve. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I didn't want to answer. How long had they been preparing to kill my father? At 6:10 a.m., Daniel left for an early client meeting. He kissed my forehead before he walked out. "I'll stop by the hospital later," he said. "Check on your dad for you." The words sounded caring. They also made my stomach twist. Because until that moment, I hadn't realized something obvious. Daniel had been visiting the hospital alone frequently over the past 2 weeks. He'd told me he wanted to support me, but now I knew better. As soon as the front door closed, I grabbed my keys. I drove straight to Mercy General Hospital. The ICU floor was quiet when I arrived. Fluorescent lights humming softly, monitors beeping in steady rhythms. My father lay exactly as he had for weeks. Still, silent. Machines breathing for him. I held his hand and whispered, "I know you can't hear me, but if there's any part of you that can, please, don't give up." His fingers didn't move. His chest rose and fell mechanically. But something inside me hardened, because I realized something else then. If they were planning this carefully, there had to be paperwork, legal positioning, financial maneuvering, motive beyond just inheritance, which meant the betrayal was bigger than an affair, much bigger. I left the hospital and drove straight to Bennett Agricultural Technologies headquarters downtown. I wasn't supposed to be involved in company matters. I never wanted to be. But as Arthur Bennett's only biological child, I still had limited access privileges. The receptionist greeted me politely. "Ms. Whitmore, good morning." I nodded and headed straight for the executive records office. What I found there changed everything again. Because 3 weeks before my father's stroke, exactly 22 days earlier, he had signed a revised estate trust amendment, one I had never been told about. And the primary financial advisor listed on the documentation wasn't Margaret. It wasn't the company board. It wasn't even his longtime attorney. It was Daniel Whitmore, my husband. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, because that meant Daniel wasn't just sleeping with my stepmother. He was legally embedded inside my father's financial control system, positioned perfectly before the stroke ever happened, which led to a terrifying possibility I wasn't ready to accept. What if my father's collapse wasn't random at all? I stared at the document timestamp. November 12th. The stroke happened December 4th, 22 days later. And in those 22 days, Daniel and Margaret had gained complete legal proximity to everything. That was when the final piece of dread slid into place, because I suddenly remembered something small, something that had seemed harmless at the time. 3 days before my father collapsed, Daniel had insisted on preparing his nightly herbal supplement drink himself. He said it was a husband bonding moment. Now, standing there with the documents shaking in my hands, I realized that might have been the first step in something much worse. And I still didn't know the most terrifying truth yet, because later that afternoon, when I returned home, I found a message on Daniel's unlocked tablet that proved they weren't just planning my father's death. They were already deciding what to do with me afterward. At 4:26 p.m. the next day, while the winter sun was fading behind the Sacramento skyline, I opened Daniel Whitmore's tablet and saw a message thread that contained exactly 37 deleted conversations restored by CloudSync. The last one had been sent just 12 minutes earlier, and it began with a single line that made my throat go completely dry. "Once Arthur is declared, we need to finalize Lila's settlement strategy. If you've ever read words about yourself that were never meant for your eyes, tell me, did it feel like anger first, or like ice spreading through your veins? Because for me, it was ice. Pure, absolute stillness." The message was from Margaret Harlow Bennett. Daniel's reply came seconds later. "I agree. The cleaner the exit, the less risk." Cleaner exit. They were talking about my life like it was a business liability. I sat there staring at the screen, forcing myself to breathe slowly, because I understood something critical in that moment. If I reacted emotionally, I would lose everything. If I stayed calm, I might be able to save my father and destroy them both. I kept scrolling. There were discussions about trust distributions, estate transfer triggers, board votes, insurance policies. Numbers filled the screen. 70 million life insurance, 430 million in equity assets, 38 million in liquid holdings. They spoke about it all in the same tone someone uses to plan a vacation. Then I saw something worse. A message dated 3 weeks before my father's stroke. "He's been complaining about fatigue and headaches. That could help explain things later. Daniel, I've adjusted the dosage schedule slowly. No one will notice." My hands started shaking. Dosage schedule. Adjusted slowly. That wasn't a one-time act. That was prolonged exposure. Gradual harm. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to those last weeks before my father collapsed. He had complained about dizziness. He had said his hands sometimes trembled. We all assumed it was stress, from business pressure. Now, I knew better. And in that moment, I crossed from suspicion into certainty. They hadn't just planned to let him die. They had been poisoning him. Slowly, methodically, for weeks. I closed my eyes and forced myself not to cry, because tears wouldn't help him. Evidence would. I took photos of every single message, timestamp by timestamp. 37 conversations, 72 screenshots. I emailed them to a private encrypted account I created years ago for medical case backups. Then I put the tablet back exactly where it had been. At 6:02 p.m., Daniel walked into the house smiling, carrying takeout Thai food. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man whose future was secure. "How's your dad?" he asked casually. I looked at him across the kitchen counter, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly, not as my husband, not as someone I loved, but as a calculated stranger wearing a familiar face. "Stable," I said calmly. He nodded, satisfied. That was when I understood something terrifying. He truly believed I suspected nothing, which meant I had time. Time to gather proof. Time to plan. Time to make sure their perfect crime unraveled publicly. But there was still one thing I didn't understand. Why now? Why escalate to potassium chloride when they'd already been poisoning him gradually? The answer came later that night. At 9:41 p.m., Daniel stepped outside to take a call. He left the back door slightly open, and I heard everything. His voice was low, tense. "I told you the board is getting restless," he whispered. "They want Arthur either recovered or declared within weeks. We can't drag this out." Margaret's voice came faintly through the phone speaker. "That's why the next step is necessary," she said calmly. "One cardiac event. Natural timing. End of discussion." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And Lila?" There was a pause. Then Margaret said something that changed the entire battlefield. "She signs the spousal non-contest agreement after the funeral," Margaret replied. "Or she loses everything. The prenup protects us." The prenup. My stomach dropped. Because Daniel had insisted on that document before our wedding. He said it was to protect both of us. I had trusted him completely. I never imagined it was part of a long-term plan. A legal trap designed years in advance. I stood frozen behind the kitchen wall, listening. Daniel spoke again. "And if she refuses?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Then she becomes unstable in the narrative," she said coolly. "Grief, emotional breakdown, poor financial judgment. Courts rarely side with that." My heart pounded slowly, steadily, not with panic, with clarity. Because in that moment, I realized something crucial. They weren't just planning to kill my father. They were planning to erase me legally afterward, financially, reputationally, completely. And they were confident it would work, which meant they had something else on their side, something I hadn't discovered yet. Because people that certain don't rely on luck. They rely on leverage. The next morning, I decided to find out exactly what that leverage was. So I did something Daniel never expected. I went to meet my father's original estate attorney, the one who had been suddenly retired 6 months earlier. His name was Victor Hale. And what he told me during that meeting was the moment I realized this conspiracy had started long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. At 10:08 a.m., 2 days after New Year's, I sat across from Victor Hale in his small, dim law office, while he stared at me in silence for a full 17 seconds before speaking. The first thing he said was not a greeting. It was a warning. "You shouldn't have come here alone, Lila." If you've ever walked into a room expecting answers, but felt something much darker waiting instead, tell me, did you keep listening, or did you turn around and run? Because I stayed. And what Victor Hale told me that morning confirmed something I hadn't fully allowed myself to believe yet. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just greed. This was a long game, a meticulously planned takeover that had begun nearly a year before my father collapsed. Victor Hale had been my father's estate attorney for 26 years. He was the one who drafted the original Bennett Family Trust, the document that controlled the distribution of my father's personal and corporate wealth. 6 months ago, he had been abruptly replaced. Officially, the explanation was retirement due to health concerns. In reality, it was something very different. Victor leaned forward slightly. "Your father came to see me last spring," he said quietly. "He was worried about Margaret." My chest tightened. "Worried how?" I asked. Victor hesitated before answering. "He believed she was influencing his financial decisions in ways that didn't make sense," he said. "Pressuring him to consolidate authority structures, pushing for trust amendments that would reduce oversight." That matched exactly what I'd seen in the company records. "But that's not the worst part," Victor continued. He opened a folder and slid a document toward me. It was dated 10 months before my father's stroke, and it was signed by Arthur Bennett. A private memo to his legal counsel. The contents made my pulse spike. I suspect Margaret Harlow Bennett is attempting to manipulate executive control of Bennett Agricultural Technologies through undue influence and potential collusion with external advisors. External advisors. I didn't need to guess who that meant. Daniel. Victor watched my reaction carefully. Your father asked me to investigate, quietly, he said. He wanted to confirm whether anyone inside his circle was exploiting his trust. I swallowed hard. Did you find anything? Victor nodded slowly. Yes, he said. But before I could present my findings, Margaret terminated my contract and replaced me with a new legal firm. My stomach dropped, because that meant one thing. They hadn't just been planning this. They had been eliminating obstacles one by one. Victor leaned back, his expression grim. I tried to warn Arthur before I was forced out, he said. But by then, Daniel Whitmore had already gained access to key financial advisory roles. The room felt suddenly smaller. He positioned himself perfectly, Victor continued. Gradually, quietly, the way a strategist moves before a takeover. I felt my fingers curl against the chair, because that word takeover was exactly what this was. Not just inheritance, corporate control, power, hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. And then Victor said something that sent a chill through my entire body. Arthur told me one more thing before I left, he said quietly. He said if anything ever happened to him suddenly, he wanted you to know it wasn't an accident. The words hit like a physical blow, because that meant my father had suspected danger before he collapsed. He just hadn't been able to stop it in time. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Did he leave any protections? I asked. Victor hesitated again. Then he nodded. Yes, he said, but they were incomplete. My heart pounded. What kind of protections? Victor opened another folder. Inside was a document labeled Conditional Safeguard Clause. It had been drafted as a secondary contingency measure within the Bennett Family Trust. If activated, it would temporarily freeze all executive authority transfers under specific suspicious circumstances, including medical incapacitation combined with rapid financial restructuring by beneficiaries. In plain terms, it was a hidden emergency brake, a legal mechanism designed to stop exactly what Daniel and Margaret were trying to do. But there was a problem, a devastating one. It was never finalized, Victor said quietly. My breath caught. Why not? Victor looked at me with deep regret. Because Arthur planned to sign the final version on December 5th, he said. My father collapsed on December 4th. One day too early. One day before the safeguard could be legally activated. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, which meant something far worse than poisoning might have happened. Something deliberate. Something scheduled. My hands trembled slightly. Victor, I whispered. Do you believe they caused his stroke? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said carefully, I believe Arthur's sudden medical collapse benefited them too perfectly to ignore. Silence filled the room, because that wasn't proof, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew in my gut. This was not random. This was engineered. Victor leaned forward again, his voice low. There's something else you need to understand, he said. Margaret and Daniel aren't just planning for Arthur's death. My chest tightened. They've already prepared legal frameworks for what happens to you afterward, he continued. Asset separation, narrative control, psychological discrediting strategies. Exactly what I'd seen in the messages. But then he said something that changed the entire battlefield. And there's a third party involved, Victor added. My mind snapped to attention. Who? Victor's jaw tightened slightly. I don't know yet, he admitted. But the financial structuring behind recent trust adjustments indicates outside coordination, someone with significant influence. A third player, someone powerful enough to operate behind the scenes. Someone Daniel and Margaret were working with, and I still didn't know who it was. Victor slid one final envelope across the desk. Arthur wanted you to have this, if anything ever happened, he said quietly. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note from my father. Just one sentence. If you are reading this, trust no one inside the company. And beneath it, a name I had never expected to see. Because it wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Daniel. It was someone far more shocking. The person my father believed was the real architect behind everything. At 10:46 a.m., still sitting in Victor Hale's office, I read the name written in my father's handwriting 3 times before my brain fully accepted what I was seeing. It was only 2 words, but they hit harder than everything else combined. Eleanor Price. If you've ever discovered that the real threat wasn't who you thought it was, but someone you trusted completely, tell me in the comments. Would you still want to know the truth, even if it destroyed the last piece of safety you had left? Because Eleanor Price wasn't just anyone. She was my father's chief operating officer. She had worked beside him for 16 years. She had attended my college graduation. She had cried at my wedding. She was the woman who held my hand in the hospital hallway the night my father went into a coma. And now, according to his final warning, she was the one he feared most. I looked up at Victor slowly. "That can't be right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor didn't argue, but he didn't reassure me either. "Arthur trusted Eleanor for many years," he said carefully, "which is exactly why her financial authority expanded quietly over time." My stomach tightened, because that made terrifying sense. Eleanor controlled operational approvals inside Bennett Agricultural Technologies. She had signing power over multi-million-dollar contracts. She oversaw internal audits. And most importantly, she was the one who had recommended Daniel as a financial consultant 5 years ago. My pulse spiked. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a chain. Eleanor introduced Daniel. Daniel gained trust. Margaret gained influence. Then the legal structure shifted. Then my father collapsed. The pattern was suddenly crystal clear. Victor spoke again, his tone grave. "In the past 8 months," he said, "Eleanor authorized 3 major internal restructurings." He handed me another set of documents. Each one represented a transfer of corporate authority layers. They looked routine at first glance. Organizational adjustments, compliance updates. But when I studied the details, I saw what they really were. They quietly concentrated decision-making power into fewer hands, and those hands belonged to Eleanor and to Daniel, which meant something much worse than an inheritance scheme. This was a corporate coup, a slow legal consolidation designed to take control before Arthur Bennett could stop it. My fingers tightened around the papers. "Did my father know how deep it went?" I asked. Victor exhaled slowly. "He suspected," he said. "But he underestimated how coordinated they were." Coordinated, plural. Not just 2 people, at least 3, maybe more. The room felt colder, because now I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Daniel and Margaret weren't leading this. They were executing it. The real strategist was Eleanor Price, and that realization changed everything about how dangerous this situation really was. Because Eleanor wasn't emotional. She wasn't impulsive. She was methodical, patient, ruthlessly professional. If she was behind this, then every step had been calculated years in advance. I swallowed hard. "Why would she do this?" I asked quietly. Victor's answer came without hesitation. "Control," he said. "Arthur owned 51% of the company personally. Once he's gone, that controlling interest becomes fragmented through the trust structure." He tapped the document. "Unless someone positions themselves to manage those fragments." I understood immediately. Eleanor didn't need to own the company. She just needed to control the people who did. Margaret would inherit significant voting shares. Daniel would manage financial authority. Together, they would effectively hand operational power to Eleanor. A perfect triangle of influence. Legally clean, financially devastating, and almost impossible to detect as criminal. I felt something inside me shift. Not panic anymore. Not grief. Something colder. Focus. Because now I understood the battlefield. This wasn't about catching 2 people in an affair. It was about dismantling a system. And that required patience. Victor leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "There is one more thing," he said. My chest tightened. "What?" He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "This arrived anonymously at my office 3 days after Arthur collapsed," he said. "I've kept it locked since then." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single printed photograph. It showed my father sitting at his office desk, taken through a window from a distance. A timestamp was visible in the corner. December 3rd, the day before his stroke. And in the reflection of the glass behind him, you could see someone standing in the doorway holding a small vial. A vial identical in shape to the one I found in Daniel's pocket. My heart slammed against my ribs. Because the person in that reflection wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Margaret. It was Eleanor Price. Victor watched my reaction carefully. "I don't know who sent this," he said quietly. But whoever it was wanted someone to see it. I stared at the photo, my pulse pounding. Because this wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was visual evidence. Evidence that Eleanor had been near my father with a medical vial just one day before he collapsed, which meant the timeline of harm was even earlier than I thought. But the most disturbing part wasn't the image itself. It was the implication. Someone else had taken that photo. Someone who knew something. Someone who was watching all of them. And that meant there was a hidden witness in this entire conspiracy. A fourth player. One I hadn't even considered yet. Victor spoke softly. "Lila," he said, "whoever sent this, they're still out there." I nodded slowly, staring at the photo. Because in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a game of hidden moves. And someone in the shadows already knew the truth. What I didn't know yet was whether that unseen person intended to help me or destroy me next. At 2:13 p.m. that same afternoon, I was sitting in my car outside Bennett Agricultural Technologies headquarters when my phone buzzed with a blocked number call that lasted exactly 22 seconds. I didn't say hello. The voice on the other end didn't either. It just said one sentence, calm and precise. "Your father's collapse wasn't the first attempt." Then the line went dead. If you've ever received a message that changed everything you thought you understood, tell me, would you chase the truth immediately? Or would you wonder if you were being led into a trap? Because I did both at once. My pulse was steady, but my mind was racing. Not the first attempt. That meant what happened on December 4th wasn't a sudden escalation. It was a failure corrected later, which aligned perfectly with what I already knew about prolonged poisoning and the potassium chloride vial. Someone had tried before and failed. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, replaying the voice in my head. It wasn't male or female in an obvious way, slightly distorted, like someone speaking through a voice filter. Deliberate, careful, which told me one thing immediately. This wasn't a panicked whistleblower. This was someone controlled. Someone who understood risk. Someone still inside the system. A hidden witness. My mind went back to the photograph Victor showed me. Someone had taken that image from outside my father's office. Someone who had access to the building. Someone who had been watching for months. And now, they were reaching out to me, which meant one thing. They believed I was the only person capable of stopping what was coming next, because something else was coming. I could feel it. That night, I decided to do something dangerous, something Daniel and Margaret never expected. I began acting exactly the way they believed I would. Naive, distracted, emotionally fragile. At dinner, I told Daniel I was considering taking unpaid leave from work because I couldn't handle the stress. He looked relieved. Not sympathetic, relieved, which told me everything I needed to know. "You should focus on yourself," he said gently. "Let the legal and financial issues be handled by professionals." Professionals, meaning him, meaning Margaret, meaning Eleanor. I nodded, playing the role perfectly. Because the more powerless I appeared, the less they would see me coming. But I needed more than messages and suspicions. I needed proof strong enough to survive legal scrutiny, hard evidence, medical evidence, and there was only one place that could provide it. My father's ICU records. The next morning at 7:02 a.m., I walked into Mercy General Hospital, carrying a folder and wearing my work badge. Not as Arthur Bennett's daughter, but as a medical professional, because that badge gave me limited authorized access to clinical documentation systems. Enough to look. Not enough to leave a digital trail if I was careful. I found his chart. Lab results, medication logs, cardiac monitoring data. At first glance, everything looked routine, until I reached the potassium levels. My heart began pounding slowly, because 3 weeks before his stroke, his potassium levels had spiked twice. Not fatally, but significantly. Each spike was followed by a note attributing it to dietary fluctuations. That was medically absurd. Potassium doesn't spike unpredictably like that without a cause. Not in a monitored patient. Not under controlled care. And then I saw the most critical detail. Both spikes occurred within 12 hours of private visits. Visits logged under authorized family access. The visitor names were recorded. Margaret Harlow Bennett. Daniel Whitmore. The same two names. Twice. Weeks before the stroke. My hands went cold. Because this was no longer circumstantial. This was medical pattern evidence. It showed a gradual attempt to destabilize my father's condition before the final collapse. But what came next was even worse. When I scrolled further down the chart, I found an incident report filed 2 days after his coma began. A nurse had documented an unusual event. A syringe, discovered improperly disposed of in a waste bin near my father's ICU room. The syringe was unlabeled. The report noted possible contamination risk, but the matter had been closed without investigation because the room was classified as restricted family access, which meant only authorized individuals could have been there. Only 3 names had that level of clearance: Margaret, Daniel, and Eleanor Price. My breathing slowed into something cold and controlled, because now I had something extremely powerful. Medical documentation showing a pattern of unauthorized potassium-related anomalies tied to their visits. Not enough yet for prosecution, but enough to build a case. Enough to create doubt. Enough to stop them if used at the right moment. But I still didn't know something crucial. Who was the anonymous witness helping me? And why were they risking exposure now? I got my answer that evening. At 8:39 p.m., I returned home and found a plain envelope taped to the inside of my front door. No name, no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a single typed note. Watch the file labeled December board. My pulse steadied as I plugged the drive into my laptop. There was only one video file, time-stamped December 2nd, 2 days before my father collapsed. It showed a private executive board meeting at company headquarters, recorded from a hidden angle. Eleanor Price was standing at the front of the room, speaking calmly, confidently. And then she said something that confirmed everything. If Arthur becomes medically incapacitated, she stated clearly, we must be prepared to implement the transition plan immediately. Transition plan. She said it like a certainty, not a possibility, which meant she already knew something was about to happen. The room in the recording fell silent. And then Daniel's voice spoke from off-camera. Everything will proceed on schedule. On schedule. Not if, not maybe. Scheduled. My heart pounded slowly as the realization settled in. They hadn't just planned for my father's collapse. They had timed it. And someone inside that boardroom had secretly recorded it. Someone who now trusted me enough to reveal the truth. But the most chilling part came at the end of the video. As the meeting adjourned, the camera angle shifted slightly, just enough to capture the reflection in a glass wall. And in that reflection, I saw who had placed the hidden camera, because the person adjusting it was someone I never expected. Someone who had been quietly beside me in the hospital hallway from the very beginning. At 11:06 p.m. that night, sitting alone in the dark glow of my laptop, I paused the boardroom recording at exactly the frame where the reflection in the glass wall showed the person adjusting the hidden camera. I stared at that frozen image for a full 30 seconds before my mind accepted what my eyes already knew. It was Dr. Hannah Ruiz, my father's attending neurologist. If you've ever realized that the person you thought was simply helping you survive was actually hiding something enormous, tell me, did you feel relief first or fear? Because I felt both at once. Hannah Ruiz was the one who had sat with me during the first night of my father's coma. She was the one who explained brainstem reflexes, ventilator dependency, prognosis probabilities. She spoke gently, with quiet authority, like someone who truly cared. And now I knew she had been secretly recording executive meetings, watching Eleanor, watching Daniel, watching Margaret, which meant she hadn't just suspected something, she had been investigating them silently. For months, I leaned back slowly, my heartbeat steady, because this changed the balance of power in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't alone anymore. There was someone On the inside, someone with access to medical records, hospital authority, professional credibility, and most importantly, someone who already knew the truth. But it also meant something else, something far more dangerous. If Hannah had been collecting evidence quietly, then she had also been watching me, testing whether I could be trusted, which meant this moment, the delivery of that flash drive, was not random. It was a decision. She had chosen me. The next morning, I didn't call her. I didn't text. I did something much more deliberate. I went to the hospital at the exact time she started her shift, 7 a.m. I waited outside the ICU staff entrance. When she stepped out of the elevator at 7:12, she saw me immediately, and she didn't look surprised. Not even slightly. She simply stopped walking. For a moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no pretense, just understanding. Then she spoke first. "You watched it," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded once. "Yes," she exhaled slowly. Relief, not fear. That told me everything. She trusted me now. We moved to an empty consultation room down the hall. The door closed softly behind us. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Hannah Ruiz said the words that shifted this entire war into a new phase. "They tried to kill him 3 times. My chest tightened. 3? She nodded. Her voice remained calm. "Clinical. The potassium spikes you found were the first 2 attempts," she said. "Non-lethal doses designed to weaken cardiac stability over time." Exactly what I had suspected. But hearing it confirmed by a physician made it real in a way nothing else had. "And the third?" I asked quietly. Hannah's expression hardened slightly. "The stroke wasn't natural," she said. The room seemed to go completely silent, because this was the moment the truth crossed into its final, irreversible form. Hannah continued, "Your father was administered an anticoagulant interaction agent at a dosage level that dramatically increased hemorrhagic risk," she explained. "Combined with his existing hypertension, it made a catastrophic stroke almost inevitable." I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't passive harm. This was medical sabotage. Deliberate, precise, calculated. "They didn't administer it directly," Hannah added. "It was introduced through his daily supplement routine." My mind flashed instantly to that memory. Daniel insisting on preparing my father's herbal drink himself. The last normal evening before everything changed. Hannah watched my reaction carefully. "You already knew that part, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded once. "Yes." She didn't look surprised. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "There's something else you need to understand," she said. My pulse steadied again. "What?" Her next words came slowly. "They didn't intend for him to survive the stroke." A cold weight settled in my chest. "But he did," she continued. "Because emergency response arrived faster than expected, which meant something crucial. Their plan had failed. My father wasn't supposed to remain alive in a coma. He was supposed to die quickly, cleanly, without prolonged medical scrutiny. And now, because he hadn't died, they were trying to finish what they started. That's why the potassium chloride vial existed. That's why Daniel had been visiting alone. That's why Eleanor had spoken about a transition plan on schedule. Everything aligned perfectly." I looked at Hannah, my voice quiet but steady. "Why didn't you report this to the police?" She held my gaze. "Because I didn't have proof strong enough to survive legal counterattack," she said calmly. "Eleanor Price has enormous corporate influence. Margaret controls the estate narrative. Daniel controls financial documentation." That made devastating sense. Without airtight evidence, any accusation could be destroyed, and Hannah's career along with it. "So you started gathering it quietly," I said. She nodded. "For 6 months," she confirmed. 6 months. That meant she had suspected the conspiracy long before my father collapsed, long before I ever imagined anything was wrong. "And now?" I asked. Her eyes didn't waver. "Now the window is closing," she said. My pulse slowed. "Because they're preparing the final step," she continued. "A cardiac termination event that will look completely natural." I already knew what that meant. Potassium chloride, 1 injection, no obvious forensic trail. End of discussion. But then, Hannah said something that changed everything again. "They're planning to do it within the next 14 days. She said quietly. 14 days. 2 weeks. That was all the time left before my father would be gone forever. And the most terrifying part? was still ahead, because Hannah opened her tablet and turned the screen toward me. It showed a scheduled internal board event, a public one, a corporate New Year's strategy summit. Date, January 20th. Location, Bennett Agricultural Technologies, Grand Conference Hall. Attendance, board members, investors, media partners. And at the bottom of the event description was one chilling line. Announcement of permanent executive leadership transition. Hannah's voice was calm but firm. They intend to declare your father's death or irreversible brain failure publicly at that event, she said. My heart beat once, slow, heavy, because now I understood their entire strategy. They weren't just planning a murder. They were planning a public victory, a moment where they would take control in front of witnesses, investors, and media, making everything appear legitimate and irreversible, which meant something else. That same event could also become the place where everything collapsed. If I played this correctly, I looked at Hannah Ruiz, my voice steady, colder than I'd ever heard it. Then that's where we stopped them. She held my gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded once, because she understood exactly what I meant. And that was the moment my silence truly began to change into something far more dangerous. Because from that point forward, I stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about timing. At 6:03 a.m. the next morning, exactly 12 days before the Bennett Agricultural Technologies Leadership Summit, I opened a new encrypted folder on my laptop and named it simply January 20. It was the first time since this nightmare began that I felt completely calm. Not safe, not relieved. Calm in the way surgeons are calm before making a precise incision, because now there was a timeline. 12 days, 288 hours. That was how long we had to dismantle a conspiracy built over nearly a year. If you've ever had to pretend everything was normal while secretly preparing to protect someone you love, tell me, did it feel like strength? Or did it feel like slowly becoming someone you didn't recognize anymore? Because for me, it felt like both. I was no longer reacting. I was planning. The first step was simple. Preserve evidence in a way that couldn't be erased. Hannah Ruiz helped me create redundant backups of everything we had. Hospital logs, potassium anomaly reports, the syringe incident documentation, the executive boardroom video, time-stamped message screenshots from Daniel's tablet. Each file was stored in 3 separate encrypted locations, one cloud-based, one on physical drives, and one held under legal escrow by Victor Hale. If anything happened to either of us, those files would automatically be released to authorities. That was our insurance policy, because the truth was something else entirely. Margaret, Daniel, and Eleanor were powerful, but they weren't untouchable. What made them dangerous wasn't violence. It was narrative control. They knew how to shape perception, which meant to defeat them, we had to control the story first. That required something more than evidence. It required timing. And witnesses, lots of them. That's why the January 20th summit wasn't just their stage. It would become ours. But before we could reach that point, there was something else I needed to do. Something personal, something extremely difficult. I had to keep living beside Daniel Whitmore, pretending to trust him, pretending to love him for 12 more days. On January 9th at 7:45 p.m., we sat across from each other at the dinner table while he talked about upcoming company changes. His tone was careful, reassuring, like someone easing a child into an unpleasant truth. You should start thinking about what you want long-term, he said gently. After your father's situation resolves. Resolves, not recovers. Not improves. Resolves. He was already speaking in the language of inevitability. I kept my voice soft. I don't know what I'll do without him, I said quietly. That part wasn't an act. It was the only truth I allowed myself to feel in front of him. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You'll have me, he said. The words landed like ice, because by then, I knew something he didn't. He wouldn't have me much longer. And that was when I made the second critical decision in this plan. I would not confront him privately. I would not argue. I would not accuse. I would let him believe he had already won. Because the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's patient and perfectly timed. 3 days later, on January 12th, Hannah called me with new information that accelerated everything. They've requested a special ICU access extension, she said. My pulse steadied instantly. For when? I asked. January 18th, she replied, 2 days before the summit. Exactly the timeline we feared. That was when they planned to finish my father. That gave us a narrow window, because we couldn't stop them too early. If we intervened prematurely, they would deny everything and destroy evidence. We had to let them act, let them expose themselves. But we also had to ensure my father survived, which meant Hannah had to do something extraordinarily risky. She had to quietly adjust ICU monitoring protocols, not to harm, but to protect. Additional covert potassium level tracking, unlogged cardiac event alerts, silent observation during all family visits. If Daniel or Margaret attempted anything, we would know immediately. But there was still one missing piece. Eleanor Price. She was the most careful of all, the least likely to make a direct move, which meant we needed proof of her involvement beyond the boardroom video. And that proof came in a way I never expected. On January 14th at 2:28 p.m., Victor Hale called me urgently. I found something, he said. What? Your father didn't just leave a memo warning you about Eleanor, Victor continued. He initiated a private internal audit 6 months ago. My heart beat once, slow and heavy. What did it show? Victor's voice lowered. Financial anomalies, he said. Subtle asset redirections through shell consulting contracts authorized by Eleanor. Millions of dollars. Quietly moved, not stolen outright, but positioned, like pieces on a chessboard, preparing for a takeover. Victor sent me the documentation that evening. When I read it, I finally understood Eleanor's true motive. It wasn't just control of the company. It was something far larger. Bennett Agricultural Technologies held exclusive patents on smart irrigation AI systems valued at over $2 billion globally. If Eleanor gained operational command, she could redirect international licensing rights. She could reshape entire agricultural markets. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a corporate power seizure at an international scale. And now we had proof, tying her financially to the plan. But there was still one final step, the most dangerous one. We needed them to attempt the final act, and we needed it to happen under conditions that exposed them completely. On January 16th, Daniel came home unusually late. At 11:52 p.m., I pretended to be asleep, but I watched him carefully through half-closed eyes as he quietly opened his briefcase. Inside, I saw the same silver vial again, and this time, there were 2 of them. My pulse remained steady, because that confirmed everything. The final attempt was imminent. But what Daniel didn't know was that Hannah had already replaced the ICU medication disposal protocols with covert forensic capture procedures, which meant if he used that vial, it wouldn't disappear quietly. It would become the most powerful piece of evidence we had. And now, everything came down to one question. Could I continue pretending for 4 more days, knowing that the man sleeping beside me was planning to kill my father before the week ended? At 2:11 a.m. on January 18th, exactly 48 hours before the leadership summit, I lay awake in the dark, listening to Daniel Whitmore breathe beside me, while silently counting each second like it was the ticking of a clock towards something irreversible. Because by then, I knew something with absolute certainty. Tonight would be the night they made their final move. If you've ever had to lie perfectly still while knowing someone next to you was capable of destroying everything you loved, tell me, did your heart race? Or did it slow down into something terrifyingly calm? Mine slowed. Not from peace, from precision. At 2:19 a.m., Daniel shifted quietly in bed. At 2:22, he carefully slid out without turning on the light. I kept my breathing slow and even, my eyes barely open. I watched his silhouette move across the room. He didn't go to the bathroom. He went straight to his briefcase. He opened it silently, and I saw the faint metallic glint of the silver vial in his hand. My pulse didn't spike, because this was the moment we had been preparing for. Daniel dressed quickly, quietly, like someone who had rehearsed this exact routine before. He didn't wake me. He didn't hesitate. By 2:29 a.m., he was walking out the front door. I waited exactly 60 seconds before sitting up. Then I picked up my phone and sent a single message to Hannah Ruiz. He's on the way. Her reply came immediately. "We're ready." At 2:47 a.m., Daniel entered Mercy General Hospital using his authorized family access badge. Hannah had already placed 2 silent observers on the ICU floor. Trusted senior nurses who had no connection to hospital administration and understood the gravity of what was about to happen. All monitoring systems were covertly recording, not just standard medical logs, but video, audio, chain of custody documentation, everything necessary to hold up in court. Because tonight, they weren't just protecting my father, they were capturing the crime itself. At 2:55 a.m., Daniel entered my father's ICU room alone. The camera installed inside the overhead monitoring panel recorded everything. He approached the bed calmly, professionally, like someone who had done this in his mind 100 times. He removed the vial from his pocket, drew the clear liquid into a syringe, checked the IV line connection. His movements were steady, controlled, cold. There was no hesitation, no visible emotion, just execution. But what he didn't know was that the IV port he accessed had been replaced with a forensic sampling connector earlier that night. The moment he inserted the syringe, the system flagged it automatically. Hannah and the observers moved in immediately. At 2:57 a.m., the ICU door opened. Daniel froze mid-injection. Hannah's voice was calm but firm. "Step away from the patient." For the first time in this entire nightmare, I saw Daniel Whitmore lose control. His face went completely pale. His hand trembled. He tried to speak. No words came out. One of the nurses secured the syringe. Another documented the scene. Everything was recorded, time-stamped, irrefutable. The potassium chloride solution was sealed immediately as forensic evidence. Daniel didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, as if the entire world had just collapsed in silence around him. Hannah called hospital security, and within minutes, he was escorted out of the ICU. But he wasn't arrested. Yet. Because we had decided something very specific. This wasn't the end. This was only the first exposure. The real collapse would happen publicly, exactly where they planned to celebrate their victory. At 3:26 a.m., Hannah called me. "It's done," she said. My chest rose and fell slowly. "Is he alive?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Stable." The relief that moved through me was quiet, deep, almost painful. Because for the first time since this began, I knew my father was safe from immediate harm. But the war wasn't over yet. It was just entering its most dangerous phase. Because Daniel wasn't the mastermind. He was a piece. And Eleanor Price would react the moment she realized something had gone wrong, which meant we had less than 48 hours to prepare for the summit confrontation. At 7:03 a.m., Daniel returned home. He looked exhausted, shaken, but he was still trying to maintain control. He didn't know how much we had recorded. He didn't know what evidence existed. He still believed he might be able to deny everything. That was exactly what we wanted. He walked into the bedroom slowly. I pretended to wake up groggily. "You were at the hospital?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Your dad had a complication," he said carefully. My heart remained steady. "Is he okay?" Daniel swallowed. "For now," he replied. For now. He still thought there would be another chance. He didn't understand yet that his last move had already sealed his fate. That night, Hannah sent me the final forensic report summary. Clear documentation of attempted unauthorized potassium chloride administration. Verified by chemical analysis. Video evidence. Witness testimony. Chain of custody records. It was everything we needed. Not just to expose Daniel, but to link the entire conspiracy together. Because once one piece fell publicly, the rest would unravel. And now, all that remained was the final stage. January 20th. The Leadership Summit. The moment Eleanor Price planned to announce permanent executive control. The moment Margaret planned to secure the estate narrative. The moment Daniel believed he would stand beside them as a partner. Instead, it would become the moment their entire world collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. But there was still one detail I hadn't anticipated. At 9:48 p.m., the night before the summit, I received a final anonymous message. Only 5 words. "Eleanor knows you're where." And beneath it, a timestamp for a private meeting scheduled the next morning. One I had never been invited to. A meeting that would determine whether I walked into the summit prepared or walked into a trap. At 8:02 a.m. on January 20th, the morning of the Bennett Agricultural Technologies Leadership Summit, I stood in my kitchen, holding a printed agenda that listed exactly 312 confirmed attendees, including investors, media partners, and every voting board member who mattered. At 8:14 a.m., my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number containing just 6 words that made my chest go perfectly still. Come alone if you want answers. If you've ever known you were walking directly into a confrontation that could destroy everything, but also knew you couldn't avoid it, tell me, did fear stop you? Or did clarity take over? For me, clarity won. Because by then, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about exposing a crime. It was about controlling the narrative before Eleanor Price could reshape it permanently. The private meeting location was listed in the message. Conference Room 7B, Executive Wing, Bennett Headquarters. A room not included on the official summit schedule, which meant Eleanor had arranged this intentionally. She wanted to speak before the public event began. She wanted to assess what I knew. And most importantly, she wanted to determine whether I was a threat that needed to be neutralized quietly. At 8:37 a.m., I walked into the executive wing alone. Security greeted me politely. No suspicion. No tension. Everything appeared normal. That was Eleanor's style. Controlled environments, clean optics, silent power. Conference Room 7B's door was slightly open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. Eleanor Price was standing near the window, hands clasped behind her back, looking out over the Sacramento skyline. She didn't turn immediately. "Your father always loved this view," she said calmly. Her voice sounded exactly the same as it had for 16 years. Professional, measured, almost warm. Almost. Then she turned to face me. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, assessing. "You've been very busy lately, Lila," she said. Not accusatory, observational. I didn't deny it. "Yes," I replied quietly. There was a long pause. Then Eleanor spoke again. "You know more than most daughters would," she said. "Medical patterns, financial restructuring, internal governance mechanisms." She was listing everything deliberately, signaling that she knew exactly how far my awareness extended, but she still didn't know what proof I held. That uncertainty was my advantage. "What do you want?" I asked. Her lips curved into a faint, controlled smile. "Stability," she said simply. The word hung in the air between us, because stability was how people like Eleanor justified everything. Not greed, not ambition. Order, efficiency. Continuity. "Your father built something extraordinary," she continued. "But he became increasingly resistant to necessary evolution." Necessary evolution. That was how she described a corporate takeover. "And a murder." "Markets change," Eleanor went on calmly. "Leadership must adapt or be replaced." I held her gaze steadily. "You mean removed," I said quietly. For the first time, a flicker of something colder appeared in her eyes. Not guilt, not fear. Annoyance. "You're emotional," she replied, "which is understandable." Emotional. That was the word she used to reduce me, to frame me as unstable, predictable, weak. But I didn't react, because that was exactly what she expected. Instead, I asked the one question she hadn't anticipated. "Did you plan this from the beginning?" I said quietly. "Or did it become an opportunity?" The room went silent. Eleanor studied me carefully. Then she answered in the most chillingly honest way possible. "It became inevitable," she said. "Not denial, not apology, just inevitability." Because in her mind, this wasn't a crime. It was a correction, a restructuring, a strategic necessity. "And Daniel?" I asked. Her expression didn't change. "A useful instrument," she replied calmly. The words landed like ice. Because she wasn't protecting him. She wasn't loyal to him. He was just a tool. Exactly as Victor Hale had suspected. "And Margaret?" I pressed. Eleanor's smile returned slightly. "Motivated by personal insecurity," she said. "Predictable. Manageable." Even Margaret had been nothing more than a piece. A disposable one. That was when I fully understood something terrifying. Eleanor Price didn't think like most people. She didn't experience loyalty or love or guilt. She only understood systems, power structures, outcomes. And in her system, my father was an obstacle. Daniel and Margaret were expendable operators. And I was an unpredictable variable she wanted to neutralize. Her voice softened slightly. "You don't have to fight this, Lila," she said. There it was. The offer. The attempt at quiet containment. "Your financial security is guaranteed," she continued. "You can live comfortably without involving yourself in corporate complexities. A settlement. A golden cage. Silence. In exchange for survival." That was her solution. That was how she expected this to end. I asked one final question. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor held my gaze calmly. Then she said the coldest sentence of this entire nightmare. "Then you will become irrelevant." Irrelevant. Not threatened. Not attacked. Erased. Legally. Professionally. Socially. She truly believed she could do it. Because until that moment, she didn't know what I had prepared. I stood there silently for a few seconds. Then I said the one sentence that marked the beginning of her collapse. "You already are." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Confusion, brief, controlled, but real, flickered across her face. Because she didn't understand yet. She didn't know that Daniel had been caught on camera attempting murder. She didn't know forensic evidence already existed. She didn't know the summit would no longer be her stage. But she would know soon. Because at exactly 10 a.m., the leadership summit would begin. And within 1 hour, everything she had spent years building would start to unravel publicly. As I turned to leave the room, Eleanor spoke once more, her voice calm again, controlled. "You still don't understand something, Lila," she said. I paused at the door but didn't turn around. "What?" Her answer came quietly. "There are consequences you can't foresee." I didn't respond, because by then, I already knew something. She didn't. The moment she stepped onto that stage, she would no longer control anything at all. At 10:02 a.m., under the bright white lights of the Bennett Agricultural Technologies Grand Conference Hall, Eleanor Price stepped onto the stage in front of 312 attendees and began speaking as if she already owned everything in the room. At 10:11 a.m., 10 minutes into her presentation, she announced that a permanent leadership transition would be finalized within hours, without knowing that the next 20 minutes would dismantle her entire empire, piece by piece. If you've ever watched someone stand confidently at the peak of their power, while secretly knowing their collapse was already inevitable, tell me, did it feel satisfying or strangely quiet? For me, it felt quiet, not triumphant, not dramatic, just inevitable. Because this moment had been coming for months. I sat in the third row, directly in Eleanor's line of sight. She saw me immediately when she walked on stage. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes lingered on me for half a second longer than necessary. That was the only sign she still felt uncertain. Everything else about her was perfectly controlled. Her voice carried clearly across the room. Bennett Agricultural Technologies has reached a critical moment of strategic evolution, she said. Our leadership structure must adapt to ensure continuity, investor confidence, and global expansion. The audience nodded. Board members took notes. Media partners prepared their cameras. Everything appeared routine, professional, legitimate. That was exactly the illusion Eleanor relied on. Because crimes hidden inside corporate language rarely look like crimes at all. At 10:18 a.m., she reached the critical point in her presentation. "Due to Mr. Arthur Bennett's irreversible medical condition," she said calmly, "the board will be activating the Emergency Governance Transition Framework today." Irreversible. The word landed heavily, because she was already speaking about my father as if he were effectively dead. Margaret sat near the front row, dressed in black, her expression carefully composed, performing grief for the audience. Daniel sat beside her. His face looked pale, tight. He knew something had gone wrong in the ICU, but he still didn't know how much we had captured. He still believed Eleanor could contain the situation. That belief was about to end. At 10:22 a.m., Eleanor concluded her prepared remarks. "As we move forward," she said smoothly, "stability and trust remain our highest priorities." Then she opened the floor to questions. That was the moment. I stood up. The room fell quiet instantly, because everyone recognized me. Arthur Bennett's daughter, the only direct heir. My voice was calm, steady. "Before any transition occurs," I said, "there are facts this board deserves to hear." Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened slightly. She stepped away from the podium. "Lila," she said politely. "This is not the appropriate forum for—" "It is exactly the appropriate forum," I replied calmly. A ripple of tension moved through the room. Board members exchanged glances. Investors leaned forward because they sensed something serious was about to happen. Eleanor's tone hardened subtly. "This is a corporate governance session," she said, "not a personal. This is about attempted corporate murder," I said quietly. The words landed like a shockwave. Silence filled the hall. Total. Absolute. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Margaret's face went white instantly. Daniel froze completely. And for the first time, Eleanor Price's composure cracked, only slightly, but unmistakably. I continued speaking. 3 weeks before my father's stroke, I said, his potassium level spiked twice after private visits logged under authorized family access. I raised my hand. Hannah Ruiz stepped forward from the side aisle. She carried a sealed evidence folder. Her presence alone changed the atmosphere immediately. Because she wasn't emotional. She was clinical, professional, credible. On January 18th, Hannah said clearly, Mr. Daniel Whitmore was recorded attempting to administer potassium chloride through an IV line to Arthur Bennett without medical authorization. A large screen behind the stage lit up. The ICU video began playing. The audience watched in stunned silence as Daniel's image appeared, syringe in hand, inserting it into the IV port. The timestamp was clear, the context undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel stood up abruptly. "That's taken out of context," he began, but his voice sounded thin, desperate, because the video didn't allow interpretation. It showed intent, action, evidence. Margaret jumped to her feet next. "This is outrageous," she cried. "This is a manipulation." "Sit down," a board member said sharply. Her voice trembled as she complied. Eleanor remained still on stage, her face pale now, but her eyes still calculating, still searching for an angle. Because denial was the first stage. She tried it immediately. "This proves nothing about corporate governance," she said calmly. "If Daniel acted improperly, that is a personal criminal matter." There it was. Deflection. Separation. She was trying to isolate him as a rogue actor. But I wasn't finished. I stepped forward again. "Then let's talk about corporate governance," I said quietly. Victor Hale walked onto the stage next. He held financial audit documents. 6 months ago, he announced, Arthur Bennett initiated a private investigation into unauthorized asset redirection through shell consulting contracts approved by Eleanor Price. Another screen lit up. Transaction records appeared. Dates, amounts, authorization signatures, all traced back to her. Murmurs exploded across the audience. Eleanor's calm finally fractured. "This is misinterpreted operational restructuring," she began, but Victor interrupted. "These transactions violate fiduciary oversight statutes," he said sharply. "They were concealed from full board review." Now the room was no longer silent. Board members stood. Investors began speaking loudly. Media cameras shifted rapidly toward Eleanor. Her control was slipping fast. Then came the final blow. Hannah spoke again. "And there is one more fact," she said. The room quieted once more. "Arthur Bennett's stroke," she said clearly, "was not medically natural." The words hit like a physical impact. Gasps. Shock. Silence. "He was exposed to an anticoagulant interaction agent through his supplement routine," she continued. "Medical analysis confirms deliberate administration." Every eye in the room turned toward Eleanor, because now the pattern was undeniable. Poisoning, attempted murder, financial manipulation, corporate takeover, all connected, all documented. For the first time in her career, Eleanor Price had no response. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Because the final stage had arrived. Collapse. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. Security personnel began moving toward the stage. Daniel sat down slowly, his face completely drained of color. Margaret started crying loudly, performing victimhood instinctively, and Eleanor stood perfectly still, as the system she had built to control everything finally turned against her in front of everyone who mattered. But as I watched her stand there, silent and defeated, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't the end yet, because one final truth still hadn't been revealed publicly. A truth that would change not just the outcome of this battle, but my father's fate entirely. At 11:47 a.m., 35 minutes after Eleanor Price stood silent on that stage, the room fell completely still again when Dr. Hannah Ruiz walked back to the podium and said 5 words that changed everything. Arthur Bennett is not brain dead. A collective gasp moved through the hall like a wave. Because up until that moment, everyone, including investors, board members, and the media, had been operating under one assumption: that my father was already lost. If you've ever witnessed hope return at the exact moment everything else collapsed, tell me, did it feel loud and overwhelming, or strangely quiet and fragile? For me, it felt fragile, like something that could shatter if you breathed too hard. Hannah's voice remained calm and precise. Mr. Bennett retains measurable neurological responsiveness, she continued. Recent diagnostic scans confirm preserved cognitive activity levels, consistent with potential recovery. The words landed slowly. He was still there, still fighting, still alive, in a way no one expected. Margaret's sobbing stopped instantly. Her face went slack with disbelief. Daniel stared at the floor, unmoving, and Eleanor, who had been perfectly still for minutes, finally blinked, because this was the one variable she had never planned for: a survivor. A witness who might one day wake up and speak. Hannah continued, her tone steady. Emergency protective protocols are now in place. All unauthorized access to Mr. Bennett is permanently revoked. Law enforcement has been notified regarding attempted medical homicide. There it was, the final layer of truth. Not just betrayal, not just corporate fraud, criminal charges, real consequences. Security officers approached Daniel first. He didn't resist when they asked him to stand. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, like a man who had just realized every careful calculation he made had led to a dead end. He turned toward me once as they escorted him away. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They were empty. Because he finally understood something. Too late. He had never been a mastermind. He had only ever been a disposable instrument. Margaret was next. She tried to speak, tried to cry, tried to frame herself as manipulated. I didn't know. I was afraid. I trusted him. Her voice broke into panicked fragments, but no one was listening anymore. Because victimhood only works when the facts aren't already clear. And now, they were undeniable. When security reached Eleanor, she didn't move immediately. She stood there, looking out at the audience. Her expression wasn't emotional. It wasn't desperate. It was something colder, resigned, because she understood systems, and she understood outcomes. She knew exactly when a structure had collapsed beyond repair. Finally, she spoke one last time, quietly, not to the room, to me. "You think this ends here," she said. I held her gaze. "It already has," I replied. For the first time, her composure broke completely. Not dramatically, not visibly to most people, but I saw it. A flicker of something she had never shown before: defeat. Then she allowed herself to be escorted away without resistance. And just like that, the entire system she had spent years constructing vanished in less than an hour. Not through chaos, not through violence, but through exposure, the quiet kind of justice that leaves no room for denial. In the weeks that followed, everything moved with the slow, steady rhythm of legal reality. Daniel Whitmore was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Margaret faced charges for financial fraud and complicity. Eleanor Price was indicted on multiple counts: corporate embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and attempted homicide. The board placed Bennett Agricultural Technologies under interim leadership oversight. The trust protections Victor Hale had drafted were finally activated properly. And for the first time since this began, there were no more hidden moves. No more whispers behind closed doors. Just truth and consequences. 3 months later, on a quiet spring morning, I sat beside my father's hospital bed as sunlight filtered softly through the window. At 9:16 a.m., his fingers moved, just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone else. But I felt it instantly. I leaned closer, my voice steady but gentle. "I'm here," I whispered. His hand tightened faintly around mine. Not strong, not fully awake, but alive. And in that moment, everything else, the betrayal, the fear, the months of silence, fell away because revenge had never been the real victory. Protection was, justice was, and survival was. 6 months later, I walked alone through one of my father's experimental irrigation fields, just outside Sacramento. Rows of young crops stretched toward the horizon, watered by the AI systems he had built over decades. The air smelled clean, quiet, steady, like something finally at peace. I stopped walking and looked out across the land. No anger, no triumph, just clarity. Because I had learned something through all of this. The most dangerous people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who believe no one is paying attention. And the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's exposure. So now I want to ask you something. If you had discovered a betrayal this deep, would you have fought publicly like I did? Or would you have walked away quietly? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you that silence doesn't mean weakness, it means patience, make sure you like and subscribe. Because the next story I'm about to tell starts with a wedding toast that lasted exactly 30 seconds before someone in the room realized the bride wasn't who she claimed to be.